Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we talk to Carol Portman, president of the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois, and get her thoughts on the Safe Roads Amendment, whether the state should expand the sales tax, and the extent to which Illinois property taxes are driving people out of the state. Then in about 20 minutes from now, we talk to Tony Paulauski, executive director of the Arc of Illinois, an advocacy group for the developmentally disabled, and talk about the different forms of funding and programs available for the developmentally disabled and how the state budget crisis is negatively impacting their advocacy work. Following that, in about 30 minutes from now, we attend the inauguration ceremony for Illinois Supreme Court Justice Lloyd Karmeier as he becomes Chief Justice of the court. And finally, in about 1 hour and 10 minutes from now, we sit down with Brooke Simpson, author of Ulysses S. Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Education has never been more challenging in Illinois than it is right now, with comprehensive education reform recently passed by lawmakers and our state's financing of education remaining under pressure. That's why the Illinois Principals Association acts to represent the needs of students and our members. We keep our principals up to date on changes in the law affecting education policy, and we advocate to keep our schools safe and to maintain a healthy environment conducive to learning. With all the changes happening in every field and with the ongoing financial problems facing Illinois, it's vital we all know about changes affecting our lives. That's why the Illinois Principals Association is proud to be a part of the Illinois Channel's advisory on education. Their coverage, whether that of key lawmakers discussing changes in education, an interview with the Illinois Budget Director on the state's finances, or the one-on-one interviews with those working in education, all help to keep citizens across the state connected to the real issues that impact the education of our children. I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. I'm also proud to say I serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next from Chicago, we talk to Carol Portman, president of the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois, and get her thoughts on the Safe Roads Amendment, whether the state should expand the sales tax, and the extent to which Illinois property taxes are driving people out of the state. This runs about 20 minutes.
Carol Portman, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're the president of the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois, and before we get into some of the issues, why don't you tell us what is the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois and what is it that you do?
Sometimes I'd like to say we're a tax geek organization. We do research and advocacy in the areas of state and local tax and fiscal policy. We do a lot of maybe educational work, both educating our members, which tend to be either businesses or law firms or accounting firms who are interested in state taxes, educating them about what's going on in Springfield or about what the Department of Revenue is doing, the latest trends or the latest developments there, because we're active in Springfield in a way that individual businesses or law firms or accounting firms tend not to be, yet their specialists want to know what's going on. And then we also educate legislators and the media about state tax policy and about the specific consequences of a particular provision, either a proposed or existing one.
You know, I don't mean to suggest that lawmakers are uninformed, but some people might go, you educate the lawmakers on tax policy?
How's it going?
We would have well, they might think, well, we would have thought they knew tax policy.
Well,
to what extent do they, and to what extent is their knowledge incomplete?
It's a mixed bag. The good news is that they all are down there, and I say down because I'm coming from the Chicago area myself, but they're all in Springfield because they want to do the right thing and they want to learn, and some of them are accountants or lawyers who know a lot about taxes, and many of them, though, aren't. And a lot of them came up in their government service maybe from a local government perspective, and so they understand property taxes because that's a big part of local government finance, but they maybe aren't as familiar with income taxes or sales taxes. And the tax code in Illinois is pretty complicated, and so the finer details of income tax apportionment or sales tax sourcing is something that a government official is not necessarily, an elected official isn't not familiar with. And so the intersection of that and well, what is good policy when you're talking about how much of a company's income is attributable to Illinois? Well, that's where we come into place. Yeah, the big picture policy things that I would think that they are pretty familiar with.
Now, which I know, first of all, you're a nonprofit organization,
That's
right?
right.
Are you a
That's
501c3?
C4.
C4. So with the C4, you can advocate for certain positions. Is that how that works?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
We don't have a PAC and we don't lobby in the sense of someone calls us and says, hey, I like this bill, go get it passed, or I don't like this bill, go kill it. But we do advocate with legislators.
You might stand at a press conference in support of a bill that would do something that you think is good policy.
Right, exactly, or testify at a hearing. And then, of course, our membership calls us and says, hey, I read about this and I'm nervous, or, oh, hey, this would be really good for our business or our industry, and here's why. And, of course, that informs when we're then talking to legislators or at a press conference or whatever, saying, you know, these are the consequences, the real world consequences of this particular proposal, not naming names or saying, you know, this helps this company or that company, but more big picture, this is how this is going to impact the real world in a larger context.
Just so I'm clear, too, on your mission, do you look solely at Illinois, or do you also look at the federal government and the implications on Illinois of federal tax laws?
We stay out of the federal side. We really are just state and local only, which is enough.
Do you meet, here's what I'm getting at. Do you just look at the fishbowl of Illinois, or do you also meet with counterparts from other states and go, you know, Idaho has a great tax idea that we ought to adopt here?
Well, actually, next week I'm going to be going to a conference of other tax geek people just like me. There's California Taxpayers Association and Iowa Taxpayers Association and Idaho Taxpayers Association. Not every state has a group like ours, but a lot of them do. And we get together once a year to...
Do you find little nuggets of, hey, that's a good tax policy or something?
It is fascinating. Sometimes we'll talk about bad ideas that somebody has seen. And just a year ago at this conference, I turned to one of my friends there, and someone was describing something that was happening in their state. And I thought, oh boy, I'm glad that we're not getting that. And I spoke too soon because we saw something very similar coming out in the legislature the next spring, or so this past spring. But it is good things and bad things. We share information about that. But yeah, we don't look at other than to keep track of what's changing at the federal level, so that we know there's going to be a state consequence to something or another, so that we're able to make sure our members are aware of the state consequences, and if it's a federal provision or a mandate that might require some changes at the state level, we keep track of those as well. But
I want to get into some specifics, but let me throw out a big picture question first. If you were giving a grade to the Illinois tax system that we have statewide, what grade would you give it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I'd probably give us a C. We do some things right, and we do some things that are kind of a mess. So I think from a tax structure overall picture, I probably would give us a C.
And
I've never really thought about it in that way. So
what are we doing wrong? And I'm thinking in terms of Ralph Martiri's the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. He would argue that we have a 1950s tax policy. We're taxing widgets,
right, and not
and manufactured goods, so that if I go buy $25 worth of, if I go to a bar restaurant and get $50 worth of food, I'm going to have a tax on that. Right. If I go to a hairstylist and pay $50, there's no tax on that.
That's exactly
and he says,
right.
Why should the hairstylist get all the benefits of society and not be charging a tax for their services?
Ralph, the CTBA is exactly right on that point. Most states, I mean, one of the things that we do right is that we have a number of the big taxes that most states have. We have an income tax, a sales tax, a property tax. We aren't overly reliant on any one tax because we have them all. I think we are overly reliant on the property tax compared to our peer states, but it's not because we don't have a sales tax or we don't have an income tax. It's just we have a higher property tax. But on the sales tax front, a good tax has a broad base and therefore can have a low rate to generate the revenue you need. And then if you've got a broad base, as the economy changes and evolves, like Ralph says, your tax base keeps up with the economy. I mean, we came out in conjunction with the CTBA on one of the studies they did. I guess it was about a year and a half ago. We were on the paper talking about the need to expand our sales tax base to some services. So that's an area where we fall behind. So
you wouldn't make it across the board?
Well, you can't. A sales tax is supposed to be on the final consumption. When you went to the store and bought this pen, you paid sales tax because you were going to use it. But when the store bought the pen from the pen distributor, they didn't pay sales tax because they were going to resell it.
Right.
And when the distributor bought this pen from the manufacturer, they didn't pay sales tax because they were going to be reselling it. And when the manufacturer bought the pen parts, they didn't pay sales tax because they were going to be putting into a pen and reselling it.
So if it's business to business,
exactly.
It should not be taxed
exactly.
because that's all part of a end product.
Exactly.
And the Europeans do tax every step along the way, which is the value-added tax. Right?
But they provide an input credit for any tax you paid on your inputs. So the net effect of the value-added tax is that the only thing that's taxed is the incremental added value. So when the distributor buys the pen from the manufacturer, they do pay tax on the full purchase price of the pen. But then when the distributor sells the tax to the retailer, or sells the pen to the retailer, they get to and they collect the tax, but then they get to offset the amount against the tax that they've already paid.
Well,
so they only pay the tax on the net difference.
We won't worry too much about the value-added tax. I don't know
that's a mess. That would be impossible.
I don't know anyone's going to go there, but that we should. You would argue we should expand the sales tax to some services.
But it's really hard to do.
What should be the goal? And by that, if we expanded it, would we do it to bring in more money? Does the state need more money to operate? Or do we expand it but then lower the current tax rate so that it's revenue neutral but it's more fair?
That question kind of goes beyond our policy worldview. But it's no secret that our state is in a huge fiscal mess. And most folks agree that while there probably is some opportunity for closing that gap, here's our spending and here's our revenue, that gap, there's probably some room for some spending cuts to close that gap. But pretty much universally, everyone agrees that at least for right now and for the foreseeable future, we're going to need some additional revenue. So in this instance, if we were able to broaden the base in a meaningful way and do it fairly and do it in a way that, part of the problem, it would be really complicated. Because we've got sales taxes are complicated in lots of
Which
ways.
we'll just take your word for it because I don't want to get stuck into the
No,
minutiae.
because we'd be here forever talking about how complicated.
They're complicated in the. It seems simple the way they're collected.
Yes.
It's let's say 7%. You add 7%,
Right.
but the way they're distributed is part of the complexity
Exactly.
because some will go to the local community, some
Yes.
might go to the county,
Right.
some might go to the state.
And so then
etc.
it depends on where you bought your pen, who gets the tax, and that can even get complicated when you're buying pens. But if you're buying services, then where that service purchase occurred gets even more complicated if it's a remote kind of a service. So that's the kind of complexity. But the point is, you could do it, broaden the base, broad-based low rate, and we do have a fairly high rate in Illinois on sales taxes when you're downtown Chicago.
What is it, 10%?
It's over 10, yeah. When you add in all the layers of tax. The rest, downstate, where it can be as low as 6 1/4, that's probably fairly average
when you compare to other states.
When you compare to other states, the weighted average in Illinois, of course, is higher again because so much more commerce occurs in the higher tax jurisdictions. So our tax rate overall is fairly high.
Do you do studies so that one of the arguments about the sales tax in Chicago, which you brought up, people would say, well, if I'm a car dealer in Cook County, and then let's extend it to Cook County, no one's going to be buying my Cadillac for $50,000 when they can save and have a lower rate.
No.
Have you ever done studies to find out who was right in that discussion? Did the the sales fall off as a result of taxes?
We haven't done those studies. There have been studies done, and the results are mixed. There is, without a doubt, some forum shopping, jurisdiction shopping. I mean, you drive back and forth between Springfield and Chicago from time to time. Do you fill up your car with gas in Chicago?
No.
Nobody does. And so those
because it's always going to be, 50 cents or 60 cents a gallon higher.
Exactly, and it's mostly for the taxes. So that you know that that's happening. It's really hard to quantify how much of those kinds of decisions are made and what the consequences of them are. We know it happens. Everyone agree it happens. How much? So if you raise your tax by 1% in a particular town, would you of course wouldn't get that full percent of recovery, but when you don't get that full percent extra, is it partly because people aren't buying in your town anymore and they're going across the town line to buy elsewhere, or is it because the guy across the way had a sale, or so it's really hard to do. Like I said, the official studies, the academic studies are kind of mixed on that.
Let's get into some of the other areas, and with voters, as we tape this, the election now is less than a month away. One of the issues on the ballot will be a constitutional amendment. They call it the Safe Roads Amendment. Mm-hmm. It is simply saying you're collecting gas tax and other taxes that are supposed to be going and are advertised as going to the road fund to maintain our infrastructure of roads and bridges, etc. And yet you legislators over the years are taking that money and spending it on other programs.
Right.
I will say, as the federal government has with Social Security money. They've taken that. They really haven't. There is no trust fund funded in Social Security.
Box
There's no money left on that in that pantry. So this would say you have to keep that money there. It basically is a lockbox, to use the famous Al Gore line. Is that good policy or bad policy from your perspective?
I understand the rationale behind it. I think that it's been frustrating to see our roads deteriorate and the quality of the roads and the bridges and things in Illinois, and to know that this money that's being set aside for that purpose has occasionally been repurposed. It is unfortunate. On the other hand, I'm not sure a constitutional amendment is the way to fix that problem. Putting it in the Constitution ties our hands if there's an emergency, if there are other needs. And
this amendment doesn't allow for an emergency.
No, it doesn't. It also basically says here in Illinois, roads are more important than schools. Roads are more important than other types of public safety efforts. Roads are more important than anything else, because the only money that's protected like that is road money. It forces a prioritization that's supposed to be part of what the legislature does.
And to that point, the legislature, before Governor Rauner came in, the legislature was taking money out of education. They had what they call a foundation level, that no one's going to get less per pupil than this, but they weren't funding the foundation level. They were down to about 89% of that level.
No. So that reflects part of the problem is, here's been our spending and here's been our revenue, and most people think that, specific, education advocates think that the spending on education should be here, and roads advocates think that the spending on roads should be there, and the revenue is still down here. And so the advocates for those particular causes have very legitimate points. I mean, the foundation level, most people believe, is sort of the bare minimum, and yet the state doesn't even allowing that.
I think now they are. I think with
then they did
Governor Rauner's increased spending, so they're where it was supposed to be, going back a number of years.
Right. But so what this does is says, legislature, we don't trust you, which is a legitimate emotion, because they have been taking this money and moving it around. But instead of fixing the bigger problem, this just
and what is the bigger problem?
Well, the bigger problem is, here's our spending, and here's probably where we should be spending if you believe the people who advocate for the specific programs that are in our spending, and here's our revenue. And instead of...
So some would argue, of course, you cut and some would say you need more revenue.
Right. But what this is just saying is we can't, it doesn't touch the revenue. We could zero out all of our road taxes, all of our motor fuel taxes, and all of the things that go into it. I'm troubled by this as a constitutional provision, and I also think that the measure was drafted by some very well-meaning folks. I mean, I understand what they're getting, and our roads are bad and need some help, and it's got to be frustrating to people who see this money and see it not being spent where they know it, everyone believes it's supposed to be going. So I don't mean to disrespect their desires, because they're legitimate. But the technical language of the way the amendment is written didn't get a lot of scrutiny early on, because no one really thought it was going to go anywhere. And there are lots of constitutional amendments that get introduced every year, and this was just one of a bunch of them that just kind of sat there until all of a sudden it was moving. And I have some concern that in addition to the gas tax that everyone refers to that's currently being set aside into the road fund, and all they intended was what's currently being set aside into the road fund, but the way the language is written, a lot of other taxes that are associated with the sale of a car, the sale of new tires for your car, the sale of new windshield wipers for your car, those taxes could arguably also, based on the language of the provision, go into this lockbox, which they don't today, and it would require, that would be kind of a complicated thing if that's the case.
Well, and there could be some, it sounds clear to say the road fund, but then does that mean we can work on a railroad bridge that's going over a road, or can we spend the money on
transportation purposes? Okay. And it's a fairly well thought out. It's not like it was just slapped together at the last minute by people, but it still has, so it's intended to cover all types of transportation. It doesn't have to just be roads, and it's also intended to cover the associated administrative. It doesn't have to just go towards buying the paying for the
asphalt,
and the guy driving the truck or the woman driving the truck that's putting the asphalt down. It can also cover some of the other associated expenses, but it's still it's not the kind of thing that should go in a constitution. Although I understand the frustrations and
I don't know. It would be interesting if we could have a constitutional amendment that sunsets.
That is, you could.
Because we have a great deal of problem right now. Part of the whole fiscal problem, in fact, perhaps the majority of it, is the rise of the pension cost.
Right.
That is grown and grown and grown, and devoured parts of the state budget. And this is why they only have areas. Most people don't realize that there's only a few really big ticket items, education being one. And so if you say, well, the kids come first, well, then you're not going to have the money for the pensions.
Right.
One of the ways that we also hurt ourselves, and I'm not sure why the legislature did this, they did increase the income tax, but they had that sunset.
Yeah.
So that was what, it'll be, I guess, 2 years ago it went off
it went
January or something.
Right.
That cost the state, I believe, in the area of what, about $4.5 billion?
Yeah. No, that was a pretty significant drop in the revenues at the time.
A lot of people would argue, put that back. We need the $4.5 billion. It did not make Illinois uncompetitive compared to other state income taxes that surround us. People might move out of Illinois for a variety of reasons, and in fact, a recent poll that just came out the other day said 47%, it's a huge number.
That's huge.
Are looking to move, and they said the number one reason is with taxes. But it wasn't the income tax, I believe. I think it's, and maybe we should get into this now, the property tax. The property taxes in Illinois are a killer, are they not?
That is true. Illinois, as a whole, has one of the highest property tax burdens of all states. Depending on how, you can run numbers in different ways, but we're always top 5. Sometimes we're number 1, 2, or 3, depending on how is it per capita, is it based on state GDP, how do you weight, what kind of weighted averages do you use?
Well,
we're still very high.
I live just outside of Springfield, Illinois, in a nice neighborhood. My house value would be in the neighborhood of about $300,000. The taxes I pay, if I were paying that much tax in St. Louis, my home would be approximately $800,000. So that's how high
Yeah.
the property
Yeah.
taxes are
Yeah.
in this state relative to
Yep.
other areas.
Well, and it varies a lot within the state, too. My predecessor, when shortly before he retired, he moved from the Chicago suburbs in Cook County into the city. He sold his home and bought a condominium for roughly the same amount of
Value.
Mm-hmm. And his property taxes dropped to about a third.
Wow.
The residential property taxes in the city are dramatically less than in the suburbs. So it depends on where in the state you are, too.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Dan Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. More than 100,000 IFT members work each day in schools, universities, colleges, and state agencies across Illinois. They're professionals who teach our students, keep our public buildings safe and clean, and provide critical state services, and much more. As an advocate for our members, their professions, and those we serve, the IFT works in Springfield to support legislative policies that promote high-quality schools and public services. We also fight to protect collective bargaining rights for all our members and all working men and women. We do this through an organized program of advocacy and year-round monitoring of public policy proposals. And that's why the IFT is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, whose coverage connects us to legislative debates and committee hearings, as well as interviews with leaders on key issues like the state budget, tax policy, public pensions, and education funding. Funding education is one of the primary responsibilities of Illinois state government, so we should all pay attention to the policies being proposed and how they may help or harm our children's futures. You know, what's happening in the State House today directly impacts what happens in classrooms tomorrow. And what happens in classrooms impacts the future of our state and our nation for decades to come. I'm Dan Montgomery, President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Education Advisory Board. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us all connected.
Next from Springfield, we talked to Tony Paulauski, Executive Director of the ARC of Illinois, an advocacy group for the developmentally disabled, and talk about the different forms of funding and programs available for the developmentally disabled and how the state budget crisis is negatively impacting their advocacy work. This runs about 10 minutes.
Tony Paulauski, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. We're here in Springfield. You're having a conference, Speak Up, Speak Out, and for those who don't know, you work with the ARC of Illinois, you lead the ARC of Illinois. Let's just tell them right off the top, what is ARC of Illinois?
Well, the ARC is the major public policy organization. We write most of the disability legislation here in Illinois, and we're heavily involved with making sure that people are supported in their home communities close to family and friends.
And the last time we visited, one of the key issues was having those with developmental disabilities taken out of state institutions and put them in group homes. Where does the state stand now on that process?
Well, the new administration has yet to announce any closures of state institutions, much to our chagrin. We've strongly advocated with the Rauner administration and past administrations about the importance of rebalancing the system here in Illinois. Illinois funds way too many state institutions. We spend about $300 million, almost $250,000 per person per year in state institutions.
And how many state institutions remain open at this point?
We have seven fully operational state institutions in Illinois.
And on a cost comparison, what does it cost to have somebody in a group home?
Well, you know, I've already stated that in a state institution we're talking about $258,000 per person. That same individual can be funded in a community setting at about $60,000 per year. There's a dramatic difference, as you can see.
And in the group home, you typically have, what, somewhere like 8 to 9 or somewhere in that area of people, maybe a little less?
The ideal situation would be 4 people or less. However, because of Illinois' economic situation, we're seeing 6, 7, and 8 people in group homes, and we're not pleased with that.
Now, some critics who speak against the group homes, or what they would say is maybe the group home works fine for some, but when we talk about developmental disabilities, there are gradations, and that some people are totally fine to be in a group home. Some might even be able to live on their own in an apartment, but you also have some who are severely developmentally disabled, maybe only have the IQ of a 1-year-old, and they would argue that we need to still have some institutions for those people who just wouldn't fit into the group home environment. Is that a fair criticism or a fair observation?
Well, at the Arc of Illinois, we believe everybody, regardless of the severity of their disability, the label that they carry, can be supported in the community. The key is having the proper supports there, the medical team, the nursing if the people need the nursing. But nobody can argue the need for 7 fully operational state institutions. So, we would be happy. We've said maybe we should have 1 state institution in Illinois. That would be our compromise.
Now, as we stand here, the first day of November, the state has funded its operations through the end of the year. And when they didn't have a budget passed, all the nonprofits, you included, were just struggling to make ends meet. What are you telling those who will listen in state government about your situation, the people that you serve? What's going to happen if we go back to another financial tug of war between the governor and the speaker, and we don't have any funding bill passed once we get into January and the subsequent months?
Well, Terry, you and I have been around long enough. We know that Illinois is governed not by the state capitol. It's governed by the courts. And in our area, there's a consent decree. So our people are being supported through a consent decree right now. Those organizations, however, those programs that don't qualify for federal reimbursement, however, have closed down in Illinois because of our budget situation. So the good news is we have consent decrees in Illinois. The bad news is it only covers about 95% of the developmental disability system, so we've seen some of the system erode.
Now, one of the other issues I understand is that when we have people living in these group homes, and I've heard from parents over the years in covering this issue that they're they find their child is happier in that environment often. But you're facing a problem as far as getting quality people. You have to have people who are working there in those homes to care for the developmentally disabled and kind of manage them. What is the funding issue there as far as the people that would be working with the developmentally disabled in a group home?
I've been the executive director here at the Arc of Illinois for 25 years, and in my 25 years, I've never seen more of a challenge in terms of recruiting and retaining direct support professionals in this field. There being an average wage in Illinois right now is $9.35. So we see that people who are tenured, who've been around for a while, they're leaving for better paying jobs. And folks aren't even putting in resumes, for a $9.35. So we're in a crisis right now. What we've done is we've introduced legislation to increase the starting wage for those important physicians to $15 an hour. That legislation passed both the House and the Senate this spring. Unfortunately, Governor Rauner did veto it, so we're working on an override, and we're confident in the first week of the override session that we're going to have a victory and override that veto.
When someone gets this job, is that a salary position? Is it hourly? I mean, how much would they actually, if it's $9 an hour but they get overtime, then they're going to be making more than the $18,000 or $19,000 a year. How is that structured to pay?
Well, first of all, $9.35 an hour is poverty level. Most of our people are eligible for food stamps. What happens is that would then immediately increase the wage to $15 an hour, and then folks that are in supervisory position, nurses, caseworkers, their salaries would also go up commensurately as well.
And what I was trying to get at is how much, I guess, would it end up costing the state? How many people approximately are employed, and trying to multiply this $6 an hour increase over how many different people?
Yeah, 34,000 people. The state has put a fiscal note on that of $313 million. Half of that is reimbursed by the federal government.
Okay, so about $150 million or so that would come out of additional state.
Yeah.
Is there any additional funding mechanism in there, or is it to come out of general revenue funds?
No, it's matched 50% by the federal government. But an interesting note here.
I mean, on that $150 million, how would that be funded?
That would be general revenue. Yes, general revenue.
And I'm sorry, you were going to say about a fiscal note.
And that's the fiscal note. But the other part of this is I mentioned that we're being run by consent decrees here. The court monitor has found the state to be non-compliant in the area of quality of care, because what's happening with the turnover of direct care staff and the quality of services and the stability of the workforce is affecting the quality of taking care of people in their homes and in employment and things like that. So we have a court monitor, a federal court monitor, finding the state in noncompliance. Something's going to have to give here.
And of course, as we just went over the numbers earlier, you're arguing that for every patient that you move into a group home, the state is going to be saving in the neighborhood of about $200,000 a year.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's tremendous savings. So that is one way, you could fund that. And let's be realistic. Someday we're going to get a budget here in Illinois. There's going to be new revenue on the table, and that's also where we need to go as well.
Lastly, as we're here and you have the Speak Up, Speak Out, what are the issues? Are there any other issues that you want people to be aware of as far as that you're pounding the table?
Well, the Speak Up, Speak Out Summit is an incredible advocacy event. There's 530 individuals with intellectual and other developmental disabilities here talking about what's important to them. And you know what they want, Terry? Same thing. They want a job. They want a nice place to live. They want to be able to recreate in their communities and be close to family and friends. It's a great event.
We were talking off camera, and I was saying that I've observed in a previous year, and it's always stuck with me, that when you talk about developmentally disabled, and people would use the old term back in the 50s and 60s that they were retarded, which we don't use anymore. But the fact is, I was shocked at how some of these kids were getting up and asking policy questions of the director when they were here, and it was just amazing. And some were saying, I don't want to be in a group home. I want to live out on my own in my own apartment. I mean, how independent some of them are, and they were probably asking more insightful questions than the average Joe on the street would ask.
Well, Terry, think about this. If you have a loved one or you are a person with a developmental intellectual disability, public policy rules your life. It determines the quality of your education. It determines the quality of your health care. For the folks that are here at the summit, has to do with where they live. So they're very much impacted, and they need to have their voice heard. They're the most important voice in this field.
Yeah, and lastly, when we talk about state government and what care it provides to different groups, obviously the developmentally disabled are, I think most people would say, are a group that we're not going to say, well, they should just take care of themselves. I mean, that they're going to need a helping hand from the rest of society.
Yeah, the developmental disability is not going to go away. But what we know in my career, Terry, is the more that the more stable a staff that we have, and the more attention we pay to the individual's wants and needs. My gosh, I'm seeing people with Down syndrome now that are starring in television shows. It's remarkable the progress that we've made.
In fact, I just saw someone, they're using one of the big national changes, using someone with Down syndrome as a model, just so that we're not, as a society, kind of pushing them off out of sight, out of mind, to kind of say they should be part of, the fabric of America.
Tune in and see Born This Way. It's one of these living situations that's being filmed, and it's about the lives of 7 individuals with Down syndrome and how they live their lives and their families. It's a remarkable program, Born This Way.
Well, Tony Paulauski will follow what happens in the veto session, and good luck, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Terry.
Thanks.
Next, from Springfield, we attend the inauguration ceremony for Illinois Supreme Court Justice Lloyd Karmeier as he becomes Chief Justice of the court. This runs about 40 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm Rita Garman, and I am very excited to be here today because this is a very exciting day for Justice Karmeier, his family, and for the 900-plus members of the Illinois judiciary, as he is installed as the 120th Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. I am honored to have this opportunity to preside and the opportunity to speak in recognition of my colleague and my good friend. It seems that Justice Karmeier may have been destined for great things from the very beginning. His roots run deep in Southern Illinois, so deep that he even has a brick from the Supreme Court when the courthouse was located in Southern Illinois in the early days of our statehood. Like Illinois' most admired citizen Abraham Lincoln, he attended a one-room grade school, obviously not in the same year. And he later became, importantly, a double Illini, earning his bachelor's degree and his law degree from the University of Illinois, my alma mater, too. He is deeply devoted to his alma mater and is a great fan of the Fighting Illini, as you all know. He's shared with his colleagues his first job out of law school in 1964 was as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Byron O. House, the only other native of Washington County to serve as a Chief Justice of this court. He also shared with us the background of this story. While he was still in law school, he clerked for Champaign attorney Gay Knappenberger. Mr. Knappenberger explained to him that he wasn't looking for an associate to join his practice, so he's only looking for a clerk while the time Justice Karmeier was in law school. Well, as Justice Karmeier neared graduation, he was offered the clerkship with Justice House, only to have Mr. Knappenberger offer him a job with his law firm. Justice Karmeier recently pointed out that had he taken that offer and remained in Champaign-Urbana to practice law, he and I could have ended up running for the same seat on the Illinois Supreme Court. I'm sure glad he went back to Nashville. One of the things I admire most about Justice Karmeier is his ability to make and keep lifelong friends. One example of this is his relationship with Clarence DeMoss. When he clerked for Justice House, Mr. DeMoss was a senior law clerk, and he mentored the young lawyer. Later, Justice Karmeier went to work for the law firm of Holt House, DeMoss, and Johnson, where Clarence DeMoss was again his mentor. Fast forward to 2004, when Justice Karmeier was elected to the Supreme Court. Well, his friend and mentor, Clarence DeMoss, came out of retirement to clerk for his former protege. It says a lot about a person that he makes friends who are so loyal and so dedicated. Of course, their mutual love of the Illini may have had something to do with their bond. Mr. DeMoss was also a double Illini, and he played running back for the team that beat Stanford in the Rose Bowl in 1952, when Lloyd Karmeier was 12 years old. As many of you know, I've known Justice Karmeier for many years, and I've been his colleague on the Supreme Court for the past 12 years. In all this time, he's never changed. He's a warm and caring person, and these characteristics have always been evident from both his out-of-court behavior and his in-court demeanor. When he came to the court in 2004, he brought not only his excellent judicial temperament, but his knowledge based on a wide range of experience from serving as a law clerk in both the state and federal courts, working as a state's attorney, being engaged in the general practice of law, and spending years as a circuit court judge. All of this experience has been invaluable while addressing the wide variety of issues that come before this court. He also brought something else to us. He had a ping pong table installed in the basement of the Supreme Court, and he invited, or maybe challenged us to come down and play ping pong. I have to tell you, I was smart enough not to go down and take him up on that challenge, because I haven't found anybody that beat him. He's also one of the hardest working and most thoughtful people I know. At oral argument, he asks insightful questions that have the potential to shed a new light on the issues being presented. He writes thoughtful and well-reasoned opinions. One of his greatest attributes as a justice on this court is his willingness to collaborate. He graciously offers suggestions to each of us to improve our opinions, and he can just as graciously accept our criticisms of his writings. These traits will serve him well as he undertakes the varied responsibilities of Chief Justice. He has wisely said that his goals as Chief Justice are to make the judicial branch more efficient, effective, and accessible. I certainly will do all I can to support him in this effort. I leave you with the words of the great 16th century philosopher, statesman, and jurist Francis Bacon. Judges ought to be more learned than witty, more reverent than plausible, and more advised than confident. Above all things, integrity is their portion and proper virtue. Above all else, Lloyd Karmeier is a man of integrity, and I'm privileged to call him my colleague and my friend, and I hope you'll join me in congratulating him on this milestone. Now I'm privileged to call on my colleague, Justice Ann Burke, to offer remarks.
I shall. And I did challenge Justice Karmeier to a ping-pong game, but he was playing golf with Justice Thomas that day, so he demurred for another time, which we still haven't done it yet. But Chief Justice Karmeier, your colleagues and I truly congratulate you upon installation to your 3-year term as our leader, the first among equals. The court frequently refers to itself as we the court. This does not only apply to the current 7 justices of the court, but also to the 109 previous members who have served on this court since 1818. And it is interesting that Illinois is the only state in the nation which has a geographically representative Supreme Court. This diversity in the makeup of our court ensures that no one area of the state can monopolize the court. The balance between rural Illinois, urban Cook County, and suburban Collier counties means that the justices come from very different backgrounds. It is inevitable that the judges' different professional life and life experiences will have some bearing on how we confront various legal issues which come before us. Still, while we may disagree on certain matters, as evidenced by dissenting opinions, the court speaks with one voice and as a unit, not as individuals. And because we all live together upstairs on the 3rd floor in the courthouse during terms of the court, by the way, we are only one of 2 states to reside together during term. Missouri is the other one. There is a remarkable collegiality among us that permits us to disagree without being disagreeable. We've even traveled together and seen theater together. Today we give honor to Lloyd Karmeier, a man who shares, as Justice Garmon says, our collegial background, but who also has a unique personal story which will benefit him in his role as Chief Justice. He is steeped in history and tradition and is a man of the earth. Lloyd A. Karmeier was raised from the earth, being born on a farm in Washington County. He grew up near the old site of Covington, which was the county seat in 1831, but now no longer exists as a town. And when his family farmed there in the 1940s, the old village was clearly demarked by trees and mounds of earth and the original brick, as Justice Garmon has mentioned, of the county courthouse was absolutely found there later. Most of that county seat is now gone, but Lloyd and his staff traveled to the site in late 2005 and recovered some of the broken bricks from the old courthouse, which he now keeps in his Nashville chambers. That old courthouse was the one in which John Reynolds, one of the first justices of the Illinois Supreme Court, presided while performing circuit court duties. And there's actually a legend. In those days, the sheriff would open the Washington County Circuit Court by proclaiming, "Boys, The court is now open. John is on the bench. I trust that Justice Karmeier truly demanded more dignity when he presided in the same county 107 years later. Now, those salvaged bricks serve as a memento of Chief Justice Karmeier's physical connection to the ground he lived on and tilled, but also the role and importance of justice in the frontier communities of Illinois. His interest in legal history runs deep because of his literal and figurative roots in Washington County and the state of Illinois. Justice Karmeier's education began in a one-room schoolhouse, as Justice Garment has said. He graduated valedictorian from Oakville, is that it? Oakville High School, and went on to graduate, as you know, from the University of Illinois for his undergraduate, and also attended the University of Illinois Law School, where it was during that time he met the love of his life, his future wife, Mary. Their first meeting was a blind date. He took her to a bar association, not just a bar, but a bar association. but a bar association cocktail party where the drinks were 3 for $1. And Mary tells me he's still just as frugal. I understand that he was late picking her up for their date. Yet Mary must have seen something special in him, because he would be the first, that would be the first of many legal events Mary would attend with Chief Justice Karmeier over the course of their marriage. And on October 2nd of this year, they celebrated their 51st wedding anniversary. Now, Justice Garment explained all the different law firms that Justice Karmeier was with, and when he first became, Chief Justice Karmeier became to this court, a member of this court, he reached his own personal background and asked his mentor, Clarence DeMoss, to be his law clerk. DeMoss, of course, demurred at the time, but agreed a few years later. DeMoss had begun clerking for Justice Byron House of Nashville in 1957. And later, he took the newly licensed Lloyed Karmeier under his wing. DeMoss clerked for 20 years, and he was, according to Karmeier, my mentor, my law partner, and good trusted friend. So how appropriate that DeMoss would return to the chambers of Justice Lloyd Karmeier in 2007, when the professional lives of these two men would complete full circle. Chief Justice Karmeier currently resides in Nashville, a small town of about 3,300 people, and in the county seat of Washington County. It is there that he and Mary raised their 2 daughters, and it is where they enjoy spending many hours with their grandchildren. It seems that Nashville and Washington County are an excellent breeding ground for justices. Chief Justice Karmeier is the 4th lawyer from Washington County to serve on the Illinois Supreme Court. Justice Byron House and Justice Ralph Maxwell both hailed from Nashville, and Justice June Smith was born in Irvington, just 10 miles northeast of Nashville. And if you really include the United States Supreme Court, there is a 5th justice who was born in Nashville, Justice Harry Blackmun, who served on the United States Supreme Court from 1970 to 1994. Blackmun grew up in Minnesota, however, but spent many summers in Nashville visiting his grandparents. Our new Chief Justice bears the Washington County pedigree. He respects and honors the traditions of the history of the court. He respects and honors his own personal background, and he respects and honors his colleagues. To put it simply, Lloyd Karmeier is the salt of the earth. Chief Justice Karmeier, we congratulate you on becoming the 120th Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. May God continue to bless you, Mary, your children and grandchildren with good health, success, joy, and peace in the years ahead.
Now we want to hear from our colleague, Justice Robert Thomas.
Thank you, Chief Justice Garment. So far we have heard references to ping pong, golf, travel, and theater. And I want to assure the people in attendance that in just a few minutes, Justice Karmeier will be sworn in as Chief Justice and not Chief Camp Counselor. So it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here for the installation of my dear friend Lloyd Karmeier as the 120th Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. I've had the pleasure of knowing Lloyd since 2004 when he first joined the court. In the intervening 12 years, he and I have grown from strangers to colleagues to true friends. Indeed, my wife Maggie and I count Lloyd and Mary as dear friends, and on many occasions we have enjoyed their company over dinner or a drink. On one such occasion, Maggie mentioned that she and I share what we call our daily wine time. This is an hour or so that we set aside at the end of each day to be together, to share a glass of wine, and to debrief and catch up about the day. And the one ironclad rule for this time, imposed by Maggie, and a true challenge for me, is absolutely no electronics. No phones, no iPads, just conversation and each other. Well, after learning about wine time from Maggie, the Karmeiers liked the idea and decided to institute it for themselves. And so it was that a few weeks later, I received a text from Lloyd. It read, "Enjoying wine time with Mary," and it included a photo of 2 glasses of wine sitting side by side. And immediately after that text came another text from Lloyd. And if you are looking at this during wine time with Maggie, shame on you, you shouldn't be. That little story captures so much about who Lloyd Karmeier is. First of all, it is funny, and Lloyd's sense of humor is always on display and something all of us on the court routinely enjoy. Second, it is wise. Though delivered in the form of a lighthearted joke, Lloyd's message was also one of wise and encouraging counsel. Knowing that I was, as my wife Maggie puts it, still in training on the rules and etiquette of wine time, Lloyd's message was a safe and gentle reminder to me to keep my eye on the ball and to remember what's important. And lastly, Lloyd's message was, to use an old-fashioned phrase, gentlemanly. For even as that little text was looking out for me, all the more so it was looking out for my wife, Maggie. The act of a true gentleman, which is appropriate because if there is one word that is used most often by the members of this court to describe Lloyd, it is gentlemanly. Lloyd's paramount concern, always and in all things, is for the other person. I have never once known Lloyd to put his needs or his agenda ahead of someone else's. He has never betrayed a desire or need to win at all costs, and he is always looking for ways to serve those around him. In this sense, Lloyd is perhaps the least competitive person I know, because he is never concerned about making sure he wins. He is only ever concerned about helping others to win, which is an intensely competitive, with an intensely competitive person like myself, I can find both inspiring and challenging. I'm not kidding. There have been many, many times on the golf course as our round is drawing to a close and we're in a close race to the finish that I find myself actually rooting for Lloyd to beat me. Because the thought of doing that himself simply never would occur to Lloyd. That is who Lloyd Karmeier is, and that is why we are blessed to have him serving as our next Chief Justice. He has the heart and spirit of a servant, and he will serve this court and the people of this state well. We have seen this already in the thoughtfulness and fair-mindedness of Lloyd's judicial writing, and we have seen it especially in the discipline and skill that he brings to his administrative responsibilities. In his recent work as liaison to the ARDC, the MCLE Board, and the Supreme Court Committee on Criminal Jury Instructions, Lloyd has demonstrated levels of efficiency, attentiveness, and effectiveness that are rarely seen in the complex world of judicial bureaucracy. And I am certain that Lloyd will bring these same gifts to this work as Chief Justice, where he will now serve as the Chief Administrative Officer, not just of a few committees, but of the entire Illinois judicial branch. I have complete confidence that we are in very good hands. And if anyone doubts that Lloyd possesses a true gift for planning, foresight, and administration, consider this. I have it on very good authority that of the more than 900 judges who have served in this great state of Illinois, Lloyd, and only Lloyd, maintains a working, productive farm at the office. This is absolutely true. Every spring and every fall, Lloyd drives his tractor to his Nashville chambers to till the soil. And with the able assistance of his staff, he plants and harvests a generous crop of lettuce, squash, cucumbers, radishes, and sweet corn. And why, you may ask, does Lloyd do this? Why does he keep a farm at the office? I asked the same question. And I was told by someone well-positioned to know that this little farm is Lloyd's hedge in case the budget crisis is never resolved. That, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly who I want presiding over the judicial branch of this state. In closing, Lloyd, I would like to offer you the same benediction that I gave Chief Justice Garmon 3 years ago as she stood in the very same place that you will be standing. Lloyd, each of us here knows that you have already proven yourself worthy of the office you are about to enter. And so my prayer for you is that with God's help and with the support of your family, your friends, and your colleagues, you would continue to exercise and exert the very same wisdom, integrity, and character that has led you so rightly to this place, to this office, to this moment. May God guide you as you lead this court, as you lead the judicial branch of the state, and as you continue to serve the people of Illinois. God bless you, and congratulations, Lloyd. And at this time, Chief Justice Garmon, would you now do all of us the honor of coming forward and administering the oath of office to our next Chief Justice? What's that? Move it down.
Raise your right hand. Repeat after me.
I, Lloyd C. Karmeier,
Do solemnly affirm that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Illinois,
and the Constitution of the State of Illinois,
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
and that I will faithfully discharge the duties
of Chief Justice
of Chief Justice
of the Supreme Court
of the Supreme Court
of the State of Illinois
of the State of Illinois
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my ability.
Congratulations, Chief.
This chair is bigger than mine.
This chair's lower than that one.
Where to begin? I have prepared remarks, but listening to my colleagues say some very nice and some very kind things, I shared with my family earlier that I was going to ask them to say some kind things and be brief, and they said, well, if we're going to say kind things, it has to be brief. I truly appreciate the comments of all and the support of all of my colleagues on the bench. It's been a wonderful experience for me coming from Covington in Washington County to be able to join my colleagues on this bench and now to help lead them the next 3 years. To Justice Garmon, to members of the court, members of the General Assembly, my friends, family, and some golfers who decided to attend today. Today marks a moment of transition. In this transition, I'm wearing a robe that goes back many years. It is a robe worn by Justice Byron O. House of the Illinois Supreme Court. And it was made available to me on the day that I was sworn in here in 2004. I wore it that day. I wore it for my first oral argument on the bench, and I wear it when I swear in new lawyers. Other than that, it's retired. But I mean to honor Justice House for his mentorship, his guidance, along with Clarence DeMoss and other members of my firm with whom I practice by wearing this robe in remembrance. With the oath that I've just taken, the responsibilities of Chief Justice now pass from Justice Garmon to me, just as 3 years ago they passed from Justice Kilbride to Justice Garmon. And just as 3 years from now, they'll pass on to the next Chief Justice. For the court as an institution, this transition is really a matter of routine. Since our state first entered the Union in 1818, as has been indicated, this is the 120th time a new Chief Justice has been designated, and it's been done without any television advertising, without any mail solicitation, without any rancor or anything else that goes on in the political scene. In fact, the transfer of this position is so commonplace that it merits little attention outside the legal community. So I'm especially gratified by the number of people that are here today and that have joined us in this ceremony. For the individual men and women fortunate enough to be given the title of Chief Justice, and certainly for me, the transition is anything but routine. No one could stand here or sit in this position without being profoundly moved. As a good friend of mine recently said about his family, I made a good decision when I chose my parents. I would add to that, I made a good decision when I chose my siblings, my children, and my grandchildren. But of course, the only real decision I had was in the choosing of my wife, Mary, over 51 years ago. That decision is still my proudest and best. Gratitude for my family, for my parents, does begin with my parents, who were born in rural Washington County, Illinois, in 1908. And in 1908, the same year this courthouse was designated. And in 1908, Justice Tice, what happened in 1908?
Maybe it'll come again this year.
Yeah. This may be the year that the Cubs win the World Series. I received an email from a college classmate friend of mine who said, in 1908, my grandfather was a law student at the University of Chicago. The Cubs won the World Series. This year, my grandson is a law student at the University of Chicago. So we Cardinal fans wish the Cubs well. But I'll have to say, it's not nearly as much fun without them being there. I do want to say for myself and my siblings about our parents how much we appreciated their faith in us, how much I wish that they could have been here along with our youngest sister Kay to share this get-together with the family and friends. I tell this story often today, but I'll share only a shortened version because some part of it has already been alluded to. My dad and his brother started farming the land in Covington, which happened to have been the site of the very first courthouse in Washington County. A session of the circuit court presided over by Justice John Reynolds was called in March of 1819. And my father used to say that the Supreme Court used to sit here, and I thought he was stretching the truth, quite frankly. So, but it was true, and I would say that my father could not possibly have imagined when back in 1946 he ran his plow through the broken bits of brick, which were all that remained of that old brick courthouse, that one of his children would be sitting here as Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. I also want to express my appreciation to Mary, to my daughters, to my grandchildren, to my brothers and sisters for their support through the years, their surprise at my being here, of course, and for for coming in today. I think, you know, sometimes you've heard the story, people go to funerals just to make sure that the guy is in the coffin and is dead. I think they just want to make sure that I was really doing this. But they've all been a source of strength and support for me throughout the years, and we all still get together at least a couple times a year, which is an amazing thing to do when we consider we're spread out from Pagosa Springs, Colorado, to Kansas City, to Chesterfield, Missouri, and now our daughter just moved, took our granddaughter along to Littleton, Colorado, or Lone Tree, Colorado. Mary and I have been through some unexpectedly tough times in coming to this court, in staying on this court 2 years ago, and in doing the work of the court. It has strengthened both of us and has made us closer. For that, I thank you and for your unwavering faith in me, in my honesty, and in my integrity. Now, 8 years ago, as a part of the initiative to improve the performance of Illinois judges and to build public confidence in the state's courts, the Supreme Court adopted a formal statement of expectation for judges. The statement is now provided to every judge in the state, and it makes this declaration. Within the American system of government, courts sit in the unique position of delivering fair and impartial justice. Judicial independence is the embodiment of those sustaining principles necessary for an impartial judiciary. The single greatest threat to the continued viability of our system of ordered justice is the erosion of judicial independence. Critical to an independent judiciary is the public's trust and confidence in the men and women who don the robes, interpret our laws, and who seek to fairly administer justice. Our judiciary represents far more than the sum of its adjudicative decisions. As judges, it becomes our responsibility to enhance the public's trust and to foster in the citizenry an unfaltering sense of confidence. For all that the concept of judicial independence embodies and protects, it must never be invoked as a shield for our failures to uphold the Constitution, to fairly administer the law, or adhere to the strong values of the society in which we work and live. Our independence is made secure when all judges, as stewards of the public trust, individually and collectively, remain faithful to the words in the oath that we have taken and accountable to those whom we have sworn to serve. That accountability is reflected daily in a strong work ethic, a high level of judicial competence, and an unwavering devotion to the high office that we hold. The public's expectation that justice will, in fact, be rendered, that every judgment is grounded on the proper application of existing laws to the facts as presented, is vital to the engendering confidence in our court system and institutional respect for our judiciary. In meeting this expectation, we strengthen the public trust and build upon our heritage of an honorable and independent judiciary. Now, while that declaration is relatively new, the principles it expresses have guided me throughout my career on the bench. I promise that they will continue to guide me, as I hope they guide every Illinois judge, and now as I undertake the responsibilities of Chief Justice. Before closing, I want to say to each of my colleagues on the court, thank you. Thank you for your individual and your collective wisdom. Thank you for your advice and your counsel, freely and willingly given, whether sought or not. Thank you for your collegiality and your friendship, and especially thank you for your support when support was needed and appreciated. You all hold a very special place in my life and in my heart. Finally, I would like to offer special thanks to the members of the court who preceded me in the office of Chief Justice during the 12 years since I joined the court. In 2004, Justice McMorrow, who is no longer with us, Justice Thomas, who was very much with us, Justice Fitzgerald, who passed last year, Justice Kilbride, and Justice Garman. I was not on the court when Justice Freeman was the Chief Justice, but each of them have set a tone of collegiality, cooperation, and civility that I will strive to follow. I am honored to serve and I look forward to the years to come. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I am humbled and honored by your presence, and there will be a reception immediately following this. One other thing I just want to direct to my children and grandchildren. Did you hear the nice things they said about me? This is your grandpa speaking. We have, Mary and I have been truly blessed. The children have been living near us, and the grandchildren have until Christy, our oldest, moved to Colorado just very recently. But it's good that they all came back. We have a granddaughter that graduated this year, is taking her CPA. We have two grandsons that are freshmen in college. We have a granddaughter that's a freshman in high school. We have a 7th grader and a 6th grader here, and they all came in and they administered the oath. I especially appreciate the remarks of Justices Garman, retired Justice Rarick, thank you, Justice Burke, and Justice Thomas. They obviously drew the short straws and who had to speak. The court is really almost like a family to me, and it was Justice Tom Fitzgerald who said, you know, it's a lot like going to college. You sit in class during the day here, and we listen to lawyers, bright lawyers, lecture us. We go back and we eat dinner together, and then we go back to our rooms and study. And then the next day we do the same thing over and over again. But with the colleagues that I have, with the support that I've received, with the interest that everyone has that the court do a good job and that people be made aware of their interest, it's been a truly delightful and enjoyable experience. I want to thank my brother Dell for the very nice invocation, my grandchildren for leading us in the pledge, and for all of you for being here, and I'll look forward to talking with each of you in the reception to follow. Marshall, I think we're adjourned.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. Since 1985, we worked to educate the public and those who serve as trustees and pension boards about issues that impact the financial health of publicly funded pensions. Our members manage over $18 billion in pension assets. That's a huge number. But we never forget those dollars belong to the men and women who've worked as firefighters, police officers, and as educators. We want them to know that their pension dollars are safely invested. They also want to know that someone will keep an eye on legislation that could threaten their pension. And that's why the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association is fighting against laws that would reduce the pensions earned by our members. And this is why we support the work of the Illinois Channel. Their unbiased, in-depth coverage of the pension reform issue allows us and our members to hear arguments on both sides of the pension issue, to follow legislation as it moves through committee, or to hear unedited interviews with key lawmakers as they discuss what changes are being considered. Pensions are very important. They're also very complex. Pension reform can't adequately be covered in sound bites. But the Illinois Channel provides a connection to the Capitol, the governor, and lawmakers that we all need to stay on top of key issues. Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too.
Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Brooke Simpson, author of Ulysses S. Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. This runs about 40 minutes.
Brooke Simpson, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Glad to be here.
You are the author of Ulysses S. Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. Ulysses S. Grant was arguably one of the most famous people of the 19th century, and yet today a lot of people probably have heard of him, but maybe really don't know a heck of a lot about him and why he matters so much. Why does Ulysses S. Grant matter?
Grant's a key figure in American history in the 19th century. He's the general that brings the Civil War to a successful conclusion for the United States. Later, he serves 2 terms as president at a time when the nation was trying to come back together and try to find a path towards racial justice for the recently freed African Americans. So he's a key figure. People realized that at the time. To some extent, they still understand that today.
Grant was born where?
Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822. He was the son of a businessman, a tanner, Jesse Grant. Point Pleasant is just off the Ohio River. Moved to a little town, Georgetown, and grew up there in Ohio. When he was a young man, at 17, he goes off to West Point, the United States Military Academy, graduates in the middle of his class in 1843. Several years later, participates in the Mexican-American War and acquits himself well under fire. Marries Julia Dent, slaveholder's daughter, lives in Missouri, south of St. Louis. They'll have 4 children over the course of their marriage. 1852, he goes to the West Coast. He misses his wife, his first and second born sons. In 1854, resigns from the Army, returns to Missouri, tries his hand at a number of business enterprises. He's not very successful, in part because of his health and in part because of the economic conditions of the country at that time with the Panic of 1857. Moves to Illinois in 1860, goes to Galena, northwest corner of the state, to work as a clerk in his father's general store. And that's where we find him when the war breaks out in 1861.
I want to spend more of the time, obviously, on his career and his successes as a general, which, but on one hand, it seems to me it might be that Grant could apply to people today, because as your book says, triumph over adversity. Grant did okay in the Army. He, as you say, went to West Point and fought in the Mexican War of the 1840s. He, on the other hand, when he left the Army to come back, didn't like being separated from his family, had a good decade of his life where it was just a struggle for him, or 8 years or so where it was an extreme struggle, barely getting by, failing time after time at different venues. And then it seems as if the war breaking out between the states is what really saved him. When he went to his father's place in Galena, it was really more, wasn't it, out of desperation that he had basically failed at everything else, and so his family kind of gave him a job just so he could feed his family at that point?
He struggled at all sorts of occupations when he was in St. Louis. He worked his in-laws' farm for a while. That didn't work. He was a real estate agent for a while. That didn't work. All sorts of things just didn't work for him, in part because I don't think he was a very sharp businessman. He was too trusting and sometimes too gullible. So yes, in 1860, something he never thought he would do, he went to work for his father, and his father thought, well, I'll bring him in the business, but he never saw in his son the future businessman that he saw in his other sons who were also in Galena. So it was a humbling experience for him to go to Illinois.
So he comes to Illinois, and when is that, 1859?
1859, 1860. So he's certainly working at the store at that time with the election of 1860.
And then at some point, he actually comes here to Springfield. Then he goes to the old state capitol. We're just about a block or two away from the old state capitol. And he seeks a commission to kind of get back into the Army. Who did he talk to, and how did that go?
When the war breaks out in April 1861, people do realize that Grant has military experience, including his hometown congressman, Elihu B. Washburn. Grant drills a company from Galena, accompanies them down here, and then seeks jobs out helping the war effort, works in the old state capitol, filling out forms, helping to organize Illinois' forces for the war. He is looking for a commission. He thought that perhaps given his military experience, he might be fit to be a colonel. But he didn't have a lot of luck at first, though Washburn lobbied for him a little bit, and he got to know Governor Richard Gates. It's only when there was an unruly Illinois regiment that was almost on the point of mutiny against its colonel that Grant was called to head the 21st Illinois.
And because of all of his career, we're going to have to move fastly through it, and obviously people hopefully will pick up your book and get all the details. But One of his early victories, and Grant really had pretty much a succession of victories, but was at Fort Donelson, right? Mm-hmm. What was the Battle of Fort Donelson, and how did he showcase his talents as a commander at that early battle?
Fort Donelson, the Confederates built a brace of forts where the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers crossed from Kentucky into Tennessee. In February 1862, Grant moves down with a naval flotilla supporting him to take those forts. And Fort Henry, the first falls without much opposition on February 6th. In fact, the Navy actually captures Fort Henry. Then Grant wires back to his superior officer, Henry Halleck, that he'll go across and just take Fort Donelson. Well, that proved a little harder nut to crack than Grant had anticipated, and that, in fact, at one point the Confederate forces, seeing themselves surrounded by Grant's men, tried to break out a surprise attack that at first caught the Union forces off balance, caught Grant off balance. Grant was visiting his naval counterpart, who was recovering from a wound suffered in the bombardment on Fort Donelson. Grant came back, seized the situation up very quickly, ordered other commanders to counterattack, reasoning that the lines must be weakly held elsewhere, while rallying his men, understanding that it was an escape attempt, not an attempt to win a battlefield victory, and push back. So this is a case where, faced with chaos, defeat, rout, he was able to take stock of everything and rally people and get the job done. And when the garrison at Fort Donelson surrenders, it's the largest surrender of enemy forces to an American general up to that time. And he had demanded of the fort's commander the unconditional and immediate surrender of that post. Northern newspapers grabbed a hold of that, looked at those first two initials, U.S., called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. And though he's a pipe smoker, during the battle he directs his forces using the stump of a cigar, and Americans looking to pay tribute to their new military leader deluge him with boxes of cigars, and he becomes an inveterate cigar smoker. Cigar smoking, that of course contributed to his throat cancer late in life.
Yeah, I guess he would smoke, he would almost chain smoke cigars, I think, during the war, would he not?
Yeah, there's a story that during the Battle of the Wilderness, first engagement he has in Virginia, that he leaves headquarters in the morning with 24 cigars in his pocket. At the end of the day, he's talking to another general. He decides to offer him a cigar, and he finds he only has one left. So I think the cigars acted as a sedative, calmed him down. Often he could retreat into his private thoughts while he was quietly smoking.
The character of Grant, there's a kind of a dichotomy. On one hand, we have this man who had leadership capabilities, as you alluded to in the Battle of Fort Donelson. I guess calm under pressure, persistence. On the other hand, there's some question about, was he an honest man? Questions come up in the presidency, which is going to be in volume 2 of your book. Mm-hmm. Was he an honest man? Was he a drunkard? How smart was he? When you analyze him as an individual and the qualities of his personality, what are his weaknesses and what are his strengths?
Well, I think he is an honest individual, honest to the point, again, of being gullible and naive at sometimes, because he trusts other people because he thinks they'll act upon the same understanding of what's good and honest as he does. As far as alcohol goes, Grant clearly has what I think we'd call a relationship with alcohol. I think it's debatable as to whether he was alcohol dependent or an alcoholic. He himself reflected that sometimes he could consume a significant quantity of alcohol without having it show any impact at all, any effect. Other times, one drink, and he would show the effect a great deal. I think in the 19th century, the issue is not whether men drank, most men did, but whether they could so-called hold their liquor. And Grant could not always hold his liquor, and I think that's where the issue of his becoming a drunkard comes.
That was more when he was, I think, in the state of Washington, wasn't it? When he was separated from his family? Or was
when he was on the West Coast, that first became an issue. And it probably contributed to his resignation from the Army in 1854. He had a superior officer out there with whom he did not get along, and alcohol, I think, played a role in that decision to resign. But a lot of that drinking can be attributed to both loneliness and the fact that he wasn't feeling well. And that's another thing we overlook when we look at the 19th century. Alcohol is the remedy for everything. And for Grant, it was a really unfortunate remedy because he suffered from migraine headaches, and people would suggest that he drink to take the edge off the headache. Actually, that's the worst thing you can do when you have a migraine headache. And so there are times that we know that Grant's not feeling well, he takes a drink, and actually it makes things worse. So I think the reputation as Grant being a drunkard is greatly overblown. On the other hand, those historians and biographers who deny that Grant had a relationship with alcohol that was often detrimental to his career, I think they're wrong as well. The charge you could always bring against Grant was that he was a drunkard. And how could you trust the lives of Union soldiers to such a man? And that dogged him for his military career. It's something that his superiors, including Abraham Lincoln, were intensely interested in finding more out about, whether this man could control himself if you're going to allow him to control armies.
Was there ever any example of him being, during the Civil War, was there any example or questions about whether he was drunk on duty?
Critics would raise these allegations. They raised them after Shiloh. Someone raised them in northern Mississippi in September of 1862. But there's no evidence that alcohol impaired his ability to command on the battlefield. Alcohol may, on the other hand, have contributed to some other incidents, including an accident in New Orleans in September 1863, in which his horse threw him, and there's some speculation as to whether Grant had mounted this rather lively horse in less than full sobriety, let's put it that way. And when you're the commanding general, though, even if the battle isn't on, you still have to be ready to do things. And every once in a while, I think you could argue that Grant, even when things seem quiet, you always have to be ready in case something happens. That happened to Grant several times, after all, Donelson, Shiloh, and other places. And so I think the argument that, well, when Grant drank, it's when it was safe to do so, I think that's overblown, because in some sense it's never safe for a commander to be incapacitated when he has such responsibilities on his shoulders.
The Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee came 1862?
That's correct.
And what was that, a success or a failure for Grant?
A little bit of each. Confederate forces after Fort Donelson gathered to drive Grant out of western Tennessee before other Union armies can reinforce him for an invasion of Mississippi. And they attack in the early morning hours of April 6th, 1862. Union forces are not prepared for this attack. They have not been fortified. They're raw troops. Grant has been drilling them, teaching them how to load and fire their weapons. So there are a lot of soldiers out there who've never seen combat before.
They're basically just farmers who volunteered. Right?
That's correct. So a lot of raw troops. The Confederate assault is successful at breaking those Union lines, driving Union forces from their camps back to a steamboat landing. Grant, who was not present at the battlefield at the beginning, he had put his headquarters elsewhere because he was waiting for the other generals to arrive, comes on the field, starts rallying his men, feeds ammunition, anticipates reinforcements, and by the end of the day, the Union forces have staved off a final Confederate assault. Next day, reinforced, Grant counterattacks and drives the Confederates back. So on one hand, looks like a victory. On the other hand, the casualties at Shiloh, more than Americans had ever seen before, shocked, mortified the American public. People looked for someone to blame, and Grant was a target of such criticism, and not entirely unjustifiably so. That after all, it had been his negligence and the negligence of others that had put Union forces in a precarious position in the first place. So there was some argument about replacing Grant or putting him aside. Their superior officer, Henry Alec, comes down and shells him by making him second in command, but with no actual responsibilities in that position. And Grant, for a while there, looked like he might just fade out of the war, having been a flash in the pan.
Yeah, I was going to say, didn't some people talk about having him fired because of the casualties?
Yes, and understandably so, again, that these casualties were tremendous. Americans were not used to having such quantities of bloodshed. By the end of the war, they understood that Shiloh, while horrific in terms of its human cost, paled besides other battles that took place during the next several years of conflict.
When we go into the war, both sides thought this was going to be a relatively quick battle, and in fact, famously, people from Washington at the first Battle of Bull Run rode out to watch it almost as if it was a sporting event, and then saw the Union forces routed, and people, the spectators as well as the Army, the Union Army, fled in terror, running back to Washington, basically. So in 1862, they still had not, as you mentioned, been really accustomed to this level of violence. No one in the history of the United States thus far in any of our wars where they had incurred so many people being killed, nor had the battles really been fought, except in the Northeast, going back to the Revolutionary War, on American soil. So here we had these battles destroying American property, farms. It would come to destroy cities, such as Atlanta. But as the war progressed and Grant was fighting in the West, Lincoln was obviously back east in Washington, went through a series of commanders. He said a lot of them had the case of the slows, that they just wouldn't seek out the enemy and take the battle to him. Was that Grant's greatest tribute as a general, that he wasn't afraid to fight and that he was dogmatic about taking the battle to the enemy?
I think Lincoln and others appreciate that Grant was an aggressive general, that Grant took the initiative, that Grant understood that there were moments in a battle where who moved first, next, would get the upper hand, and he was determined to be that person. So Lincoln observed that when it came to actual fighting, Grant was somebody who would do that, and that wasn't always the case with his generals elsewhere.
When you investigate as a biographer someone's life, so how would you assess a Grant? In other words, in terms, was he a great strategist? Was he a great tactician? Or was it merely that he was the dog that wouldn't let go of the cuff and just kept doggedly bringing the battle to the South and wearing them down?
I think he was a fairly able strategist. I think he knew how to move armies around on a map. I think he understood logistics very well. He had been a quartermaster, a commissary officer during the Mexican-American War, so he understood the importance of supply for his army and the importance of denying logistical support to the enemy army. So in that sense, I think he understood war very well. Tactically, he was not nearly as skilled. Most 19th century generals, most Civil War generals, in fact, were not. And I'm not sure that was all terribly important, because most Civil War battles were, in fact, bloody slugfests in which the victor suffered just about as much as the defeated. I think Grant's determination, perseverance are characteristics that many people highlighted at the time. I also think that one thing, though, that separated Grant from a lot of his contemporaries was his ability to work with his civilian superiors and understand the larger issues of the war. That Grant, who originally had been hesitant to strike at slavery because it was an institution that if attacked would embitter white Southerners and draw out the war, by the middle of the war he understands that attacking slavery is attacking the foundation of the Confederacy. It's essential for victory. Using African Americans in the ranks of the Union armies increases the size of those armies and to some degree their effectiveness. Was he in favor of that? Was he in favor of bringing the Negro to the battle? By 1863, he is an advocate of enlisting African Americans in the armies of the United States, so he is certainly in step with administration policy. I think the other thing, though, that you got to appreciate about Grant during this time is he does know how to work with the boss. He does know how to write letters to Lincoln to reassure him what's going on, keep him informed. He understood the pressures under which Lincoln was operating, and he understood also how to deal with Lincoln's concerns. Lincoln, for example, was concerned about whether any of his generals might be a potential political opponent in the election of 1864. Grant understood this. So he made sure to send letters to intermediaries that stated his lack of interest in pursuing a national political career, that all he wanted to do was fight the war out. We made sure that Lincoln saw those letters and reassured Lincoln that it could support Grant and forge a command team that proved essential to Union victory.
One of the biases that everyone who reads history has to contend with is we know what happened. And yet you have to read history with the understanding of looking at the decisions that were made in the context that those people making those decisions at that time did not know what was going to happen. They didn't know the outcome. People think today, well, of course the Union won the war against the South. There was the Battle of Shiloh, which, or not Shiloh, but Vicksburg, which Grant, a siege he laid to Vicksburg, starved the population out. And it was one of the great victories that followed the day after the great victory at Gettysburg. So you had on July the 3rd, 1863, Gettysburg. On July the 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrenders to Grant.
Correct.
Those two victories, it seems to me, really gave President Lincoln the political muscle that he needed to continue on to be his reelection. That, am I right that those victories are what started to turn the attitude of the American people that yet maybe we can win this, maybe we can hold the Union together, and maybe this immense loss of life is going to be producing the fruits of victory?
Well, I mean, that's, I think, what we see in hindsight, but it's not clear that that was the case.
Well, and I wanted to say in that, how close did we come as the Union? How close did they come to losing the war?
I think they came very close, and I think, in fact, the closest they came was during 1864. That'd be after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Well, Gettysburg is primarily important for stopping Lee's invasion at high cost to both armies. To some extent, the Army north of Virginia never recovered from the extent of the casualties it suffered at Gettysburg, not only in terms of its men, but also in its command structure that had finished months of decimating Confederate commanders, starting with Lee's Lieutenant Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville. So I think it cost a lot. But in the aftermath of that battle, when George Gordon Meade, at the head of the Army of Potomac, pursues Lee, but not as energetically as some people would have liked, people see Gettysburg as a missed opportunity. When Lincoln goes to Gettysburg in November, the Gettysburg Address, he talks about the unfinished work before us, that there are things we need to do. And so Gettysburg is seen as important, but a missed opportunity that could have been even more important. Vicksburg, on the other hand, I think for all the talk about dividing the Confederacy in two and taking 30,000 Confederates off the board, is really important because it solidified Grant's standing. People stopped whispering quite so much about Grant. They began to understand that whatever their previous doubts, he was a very successful commander. And among those people was Abraham Lincoln, who began to see in Grant now the general who might just be able to win the war. But I think even in 1864, with Grant as General-in-Chief, after a spring of bloody campaigning in Georgia and Virginia, with Union Army seemingly stuck outside of Richmond, Petersburg, Atlanta, Lincoln himself fears for his reelection chances. In late August, he actually writes a memorandum, folds it up, asks his cabinet members to sign it without reading the contents of the memo. The memo says that he thinks he might lose the war. And he certainly is going to lose the election, is what he thinks. And he's trying to commit them. In fact, if we lose this election, we have to try to win the war, because if my opponent becomes president, I don't think we're going to win this conflict. We see Lincoln as a very astute political operator, a man who understood public opinion and the temper of the times. If Lincoln thought that he was going to be defeated in 1864, he must have had some good reason for believing that.
Lincoln in 1864 runs against McClellan, who had been the initial general leading the Union forces. And McClellan, as I understand it, the policies would have been that keeping the South isn't worth the slaughter of so many Americans. He was more the peace candidate. Is that a fair assumption, or is that a misunderstanding?
That's a misunderstanding of George McClellan. It's not a misunderstanding of many of his supporters in the Democratic Party, including the Copperheads, who were very much opposed to the prosecution of the war and adamant in their opposition to emancipation. McClellan himself was pledged to carry on the war. He did not have the commitment, however, that the Lincoln administration had to the destruction of slavery. McClellan didn't like slavery, but he didn't see that the war measures of the Lincoln administration were actually constructive. Lincoln's point was not that he thought McClellan would sue for peace, but that rather McClellan would have gotten victory with the support of people who would have sued for peace, and McClellan would find himself in an untenable position if he did not heed their advice. So I think we can understand that George McClellan was not advocating a peaceful settlement that recognized an independent Confederacy, but many of his supporters did believe that that was the way to go.
I'm going to rush through the end of the war here. So after Vicksburg, is that what really sealed the deal as far as Lincoln selecting Grant to become the leader of the Union forces?
That and Chattanooga, and at the same time Lincoln's assessment that in the Eastern Theater, that while George Meade was a capable commander, Meade was probably not tough enough or able enough to defeat Robert E. Lee.
Much of the battles, you have Sherman taking the South, dividing the South. As Vicksburg gave the Union forces control of the Mississippi, so Texas, among the other Confederate states, were isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. Sherman's going down to the sea, his march to the sea, and divides the Confederacy again. Mm-hmm. But you then have Grant in much of 1864 battling around Richmond. One of the battles that people look at, and one of the criticisms of Grant, was Cold Harbor. Mm-hmm. And they basically would be saying that this shows that Grant is just a butcher, that he didn't really care about human life. What happened at Cold Harbor that brought about that criticism? After all, he had seemed to prove himself a good general up to that point. And to what extent is that a fair criticism or not?
Well, Cold Harbor is the culmination of the first 40 days or so of really the first 30 days of the overland campaign that Grant conducts against Lee in central Virginia in 1864. So for about 30 days, Grant and Lee are going head-to-head with the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, tremendously bloody battles for both sides. Grant is convinced by the beginning of June, as his men are now approaching the outskirts of the Confederate capital at Richmond, he's convinced that the Confederate Army is about to crack, that they've shown signs that perhaps they're no longer the fighting force they once were. There was some truth to that, but it could be exaggerated, and it certainly was. At the same time, he had a command problem, and that George Gordon Meade actually retained field command of the Army of the Potomac. Grant accompanied Meade, but Grant, in fact, was the commander-in-chief, the general-in-chief of all the armies of the United States. And so he supervised Meade. Sometimes Meade thought it was a rather uncomfortable, too close supervision. But in fact, Meade in late May basically asserted command of the Army again. And Grant let him because he felt that Meade knew the generals in the Army of the Potomac better than Grant did. It was Meade who was actually in operational command of Union forces at Cold Harbor. We know this, in fact, from Meade's own correspondence with his wife the day after the battle. He proclaimed that he was on command. He was in command of the field all day, and Grant just visited him a few times. What happens at Cold Harbor, it's a bloody repulse. The Union forces did not attack in coordinated or cooperating fashion. The Confederates were well dug in. They had become masters at field fortifications and making them in a fairly short period of time.
So the Southern forces were mostly fighting a defensive battle, right?
By this time, but they had set up a position where they could lay down a lethal fire on advancing Union forces. And again, the Union forces had not scouted the terrain, they had not reconnoitered it, they did not act in cooperative fashion, and so the assault was a disaster. But in terms of what we know about Cold Harbor, the losses became greatly exaggerated. We know from recent studies that about 3,500 to 4,000 men probably fell in those assaults. That's regrettable. But it's about half as many men as fell at Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863. So if Grant's a butcher, then what do we call Lee? What's interesting, though, is that in the aftermath of this futile assault and it was futile. Grant himself expressed in his memoirs regret that he'd ever ordered the last assault because it could do no good, and he regretted the bloodshed. Cold Harbor assumed mythical proportions and became, in the minds of many people then and now, to represent the entire campaign, to the point that you have stories of 7,000 men falling in 20 or 30 minutes. That's been discounted, but sometimes Grant found myth hard to shake. Again, the myth that he was an alcoholic, the myth that he was a butcher insensitive to the suffering of his men and the like. So Grant remains, in the popular mind, a lot of times a fairly misunderstood person because these myths proved durable, even if their factual basis was less than firm.
So the war basically comes to an end in more or less April of 1865. There were still some Confederate, after Lee surrenders, there's still some Confederates fighting in the field. I believe the very last battle was in Texas or so around June of 1865, if I recall. But basically, for practical purposes, it ends. Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president. Reconstruction, we could spend obviously hours on all these topics. But it leads to, and I just want to get to actually what is going to be your next book, what happens after the war's end. Grant becomes president in 1860, elected in 1868. He's reelected in 1872. I told you off camera before that I was surprised to learn until just recently, I had not been aware that he sought the presidency again in 1880. And I thought it was that he had not really enjoyed the presidency. So to what extent did Grant enjoy being president? And if he didn't enjoy it, why did he seek the presidency again in 1880?
Well, I mean, I think we're talking about three separate situations. In 1868, Grant runs for president because he feels obligated to, that he believes.
Was there a clamor for him to run?
There's certainly a lot of talk about him becoming president, a man who could solve problems, a man who could bring peace to the nation, bring order, protect African-American rights and the like. People placed tremendous expectations on him, and he made it clear to others, including Sherman, that he felt that it was his duty to run in order to preserve what he called the fruits of victory. And he wanted to make sure that political wrangling did not sacrifice those results.
And the country was really torn apart at that point, right?
Yes.
I mean, they tried to impeach Andrew Johnson, and you still had this divide about how to handle the victory of the Civil War and which the policy positions, because obviously we didn't have Lincoln there to guide us through the Reconstruction period.
Right, and much like George Washington had to serve in President to sort of solidify what he had accomplished by being a victorious general during the American Revolution, Grant felt he had to do the same sort of thing. In 1872, I think Grant, understanding now he was the target of partisan attack, some fair, some unfair, sought re-election in part as a form of personal vindication and went so far to mention that motive in his second inaugural address. So I think then he wanted to win badly. In 1880, he'd gone around the world on a trip after he left the White House in 1877. I think he began to see the Republican Party was once again in trouble. His friends told him that he could win renomination easily and that he could run for a third term. Grant wasn't so sure, kept on pressing his advisors, are you sure that I can get the nomination? It's going to be much of a struggle. I don't think Grant would have wanted that nomination nearly as much as, let's say, he wanted re-election in 1872. But he did think that he still had a role to play. So did he like being president? Not really, because he came under more criticism during that time of his life than at any other. But did he feel a sense of obligation and duty? Yes. And that led him to make some interesting decisions that were not always the decisions he would have made if he just consulted his personal desires.
Time grows short, and we could talk much longer if we had the time, but we should mention, so your book that we've been primarily talking about, which was published in 2000, and to good reviews, Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. You're now working on the second volume. And again, what is the title?
Ulysses S. Grant and the Fruits of Victory, 1865 to 1885. So we take the story from the end of the war to the end of his life.
And where would you imagine you're in what process? Are you writing? Are you still researching? Or where are you?
I'm mostly writing now and framing chapters and writing. I've done most of the research. Every once in a while you find something and you might want to go back to an archive to check a few things or explore a new collection. But the research is basically done. And the argument of the book is that we should see the last 20 years of Grant's life as a unified whole, in which Grant tries to define what does Union victory mean. First as a commanding general during Reconstruction, then as 8 years as president, and then even his personal memoirs, telling the story of the war from his perspective to try to say, this is what we tried to achieve and this is what we did achieve.
And you imagine in a couple of years that'll be out?
I certainly hope so.
When you look back overall, how do you not fall in love with the individual that you're researching, because you spend so much of your own personal life as a biographer with this individual? How do you maintain the objectivity as a biographer, as a writer of history, to assess the qualities, and to what extent is this person someone who should be lauded, and to what extent should they be critical?
I think you have to remember you are not that person. That your mission as a biographer is not to rehabilitate. It's not to rescue. It's not necessarily to denigrate either. Your obligation is to try to understand somebody as a human being, warts and all. And you know, as you point out, and I've said this before, it's really bad business to fall in love with dead people. It's also, by the way, bad business as a biographer to have such vicious hatred for somebody that you can't draw back. But I view this more in terms of an umpire or referee at a sporting event, baseball, hockey, whatever, and saying, okay, you've made a mistake here. I will call them as I see them. And I think Grant's mistakes are just as instructive in understanding the man as are his successes.
When we read your biography, we can do it as readers over a relatively short period of time. You will have spent years with this person. Does Grant hold your attention, or is there some point where it's a labor where you have to force yourself to continue to mine this, plow this field of research and write about him?
Well, I think I took a break in part after the first volume because I did want to get away from Grant, and because it seemed that now, after I had written some books on Grant, all of a sudden became a popular and, in fact, safe topic for some biographers. And we've had several biographies of Grant come out, very highly laudatory. They laud him a great deal, let's put it that way. The laudatory accounts, I think, also praise him for good intentions, praise him for being on the right side of history and the like. I think in many cases are insufficiently critical of his shortcomings and are a little too enamored with this theme of rehabilitation. So I wanted to get some distance away from Grant. I had other projects in which I was interested and pursued. And I wanted to do a lot of thinking about how I would deal with those last 20 years because I know that that second volume is going to be seen by many people as my last word on Grant.
Well, Brooks Simpson, it'd be great to talk longer. Maybe we can do that again, but we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.